Oil could be transported to Japan and refined. By war's end, stockpiles were exhausted. Production facilities in Southeast Asia were cut off from Japan. Refining capacity had been destroyed, and Japan possessed perhaps few 100,000 barrels of crude oil that could not be refined into usable fuels. The 4-year trajectory from resource adequacy to complete exhaustion demonstrated that American strategy of targeting Japanese logistics and resource supply had achieved devastating effectiveness. The moment when Japanese High Command learned fuel reserves were completely empty cannot be identified as single revelation, because recognition came progressively through late 1944 and early 1945, as various indicators converged to demonstrate that crisis was complete. The October 1944 Leyte Gulf operation consumed major portion of remaining reserves. The November 1944 assessment documented that resupply was no longer possible. The February to March 1945 reports confirmed that stocks were nearly exhausted and refining capacity had been destroyed. The April to May recognition that invasion defense would be conducted without adequate fuel represented final acknowledgement that resource exhaustion had eliminated Japanese capability to conduct conventional military operations. The learning was reluctant and incomplete because accepting finality of fuel crisis meant accepting that war was lost regardless of will to resist. But by summer 1945, even officers committed to continued resistance understood that fuel constraints made effective defense impossible. The final assessment was that Japanese High Command learned through progressive crisis from late 1944 through mid-1945 that fuel reserves were completely empty, that strategic petroleum stockpiles accumulated before war were exhausted, that capacity to resupply from Southeast Asian oil fields had been eliminated by American interdiction, that refining capacity needed to process crude oil into usable fuels had been destroyed by strategic bombing. The learning forced recognition that Japan's war effort had been premised on securing and maintaining access to resources that were no longer available, that operational planning had to account for fuel scarcity as absolute constraint, that continued resistance was being conducted with forces that lacked fuel for effective operations. The fuel exhaustion represented failure of strategic premise that had justified war's initiation, demonstrated effectiveness of American strategy targeting Japanese logistics and resources, created conditions where military defeat was inevitable, regardless of tactical capabilities or will to resist. The recognition contributed to decision to surrender by demonstrating that Japan lacked physical resources to continue fighting, even if political will to resist remained, that fuel exhaustion among other resource shortages had eliminated capacity to defend effectively against invasion, that prolonging war would achieve nothing, emphasized achieving decisive victory quickly through destroying American Pacific Fleet, through capturing resource areas before they could be denied to Japan, through establishing defensive perimeter that would make reconquest prohibitively costly for United States. The January 1942 capture of Dutch East Indies oil fields had temporarily validated strategic premise that Japanese expansion could secure resources needed to sustain war effort. Japanese forces occupied Palembang, Balikpapan, Tarakan, and other oil production centers, gained control of facilities that had produced over 60 million barrels annually before the war, began efforts to restore production damaged by Dutch demolitions. The oil fields represented resources that could theoretically supply Japanese needs indefinitely if production could be restored and if oil could be transported to Japan without interdiction by American submarines and aircraft. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, who had commanded 4th Fleet during Southern operations, reported in February 1942 that capturing oil fields was insufficient to solve Japan's fuel problems because restoring production required equipment and expertise that Japan lacked, because transporting oil to Japan required tankers that were vulnerable to American attack, because refining crude oil into usable fuels required capacity that Japanese facilities possessed in limited quantities. Inoue's assessment identified vulnerabilities in Japan's resource security strategy, but was received as pessimism rather than as warning requiring strategic response, because the assessment contradicted assumptions underlying the decision for war. The restoration of oil production in Dutch East Indies through 1942 demonstrated both Japanese engineering capabilities and limitations that would constrain supply. Japanese technicians succeeded in repairing damage to drilling and pumping equipment, restored production to approximately 25 million barrels annually by mid-1942, created flow of crude oil that was transported to Japan by tanker convoy. The achievement validated that capturing oil fields could provide resources, but the production rate represented less than half of pre-war levels and was inadequate to meet Japanese military and industrial requirements, even before accounting for transportation losses. The submarine campaign that American forces initiated immediately after Pearl Harbor created attrition of Japanese tanker fleet that progressively reduced ability to transport oil from Southeast Asia to Japan. American submarines operating along shipping routes from Dutch East Indies to Japan sank tankers carrying crude oil, forced Japanese convoys to take longer routes to avoid submarine concentrations, created losses that mounted monthly and that could not be replaced because Japanese shipbuilding capacity was allocated to warships rather than to merchantmen. The tanker losses meant that oil produced in Dutch East Indies increasingly could not reach Japan, creating gap between theoretical supply and actual delivery that undermined resource security strategy. The specific pattern of American submarine operations against Japanese tanker fleet revealed sophisticated campaign that targeted Japan's strategic vulnerability systematically. American submarine commanders received intelligence about tanker routes and schedules, positioned boats along expected transit paths, conducted attacks that prioritized high-value targets like fully loaded tankers over empty vessels returning to Southeast Asia. The targeting demonstrated that American command understood that destroying Japan's ability to transport oil was more strategically valuable than sinking warships, that resource interdiction could cripple Japanese war effort more effectively than fleet engagements. The monthly statistics documenting tanker losses illuminated the campaign's devastating effectiveness. Japan possessed approximately 49 tankers, totaling approximately 590,000 tons at war's beginning. By end of 1942, American submarines had sunk approximately 10 tankers, reducing fleet by 20% in single year. The 1943 losses accelerated, with approximately 25 tankers sunk, reducing fleet to approximately 14 vessels by year's end. The 1944 losses were catastrophic, with remaining tankers being hunted relentlessly by American submarines, whose numbers and effectiveness increased as war progressed, essentially eliminating tanker fleet as operational force by 1945. The Japanese countermeasures attempted to protect tanker fleet demonstrated recognition of crisis, but revealed inability to develop effective responses. Tankers were routed through shallow coastal waters where large American submarines could not operate effectively, but this approach added days to transit times and reduced amount of oil that could be delivered monthly. Tankers were incorporated into heavily escorted convoys, with destroyers and aircraft providing protection. But convoy systems slowed overall transit and consumed fuel for escort vessels that reduced net delivery quantities. Tankers were equipped with additional anti-aircraft weapons and were given training in evasive maneuvers. But these measures could not prevent submarine attacks that occurred at night, or in conditions where tankers could not detect attackers before torpedoes hit. Captain Atsushi Oi, serving in Naval General Staff Logistics Section, compiled monthly assessments through 1943, documenting tanker losses and their impact on fuel availability. WWII's reports showed that Japan was losing tankers faster than they could be replaced, that percentage of oil production actually reaching Japan was declining from approximately 80% in early 1942 to perhaps 50% by late 1943, that continued attrition at current rates would eliminate tanker fleet within 18 months. The projections indicated that fuel crisis was inevitable unless American submarine campaign could be defeated or unless alternative supply routes could be established. The naval construction priorities that Japan maintained through 1943 to 44 demonstrated misallocation of resources that exacerbated tanker shortage. Japanese shipyards prioritized building warships, aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, over merchantmen and tankers, despite evidence that resource transport was becoming critical constraint on war effort. The decision reflected naval culture that valued combat vessels over logistic support and reflected command assumption that war would be decided by fleet engagements rather than by attrition of supply lines. The misallocation meant the tanker fleet could not be replaced as losses mounted and that fuel transportation capacity progressively declined. The impact of tanker losses on fuel stocks in Japan proper became undeniable through 1943 as inventory levels declined, despite continued oil production in Southeast Asia. Strategic reserves that had totaled approximately 54 million barrels in December 1941 declined to approximately 40 million barrels by end of 1942, to approximately 25 million barrels by end of 1943, to approximately 10 million barrels by mid-1944. The decline demonstrated that consumption was exceeding delivery and that stockpiles accumulated before war were being depleted at rates that made complete exhaustion foreseeable within defined timeframe. Captain Atsushi Oi, serving in Naval General Staff Logistics Section, compiled monthly assessments through 1943 documenting tanker losses and their impact on fuel availability. Oi's reports showed that Japan was losing tankers faster than they could be replaced, that percentage of oil production actually reaching Japan was declining from approximately 80% in early 1942 to perhaps 50% by late 1943, that continued attrition at current rates would eliminate tanker fleet within 18 months. The projections indicated that fuel crisis was inevitable unless American submarine campaign could be defeated or unless alternative supply routes could be established. The strategic response to fuel shortage that Japanese command implemented through 1943 to 44 emphasized conservation rather than addressing root causes of supply problems. Fuel allocations for training were reduced to minimal levels, limiting pilot training to basic skills and eliminating advanced tactical training that required extensive flying time. Naval operations were planned to minimize fuel consumption, with sorties limited to essential missions and with forces held in port except when operations were critical. Industrial fuel allocations were reduced progressively as supplies declined, forcing factories to curtail production and creating cascading effects through economy. Admiral Semu Toyoda, appointed Commander-in-Chief of Combined Fleet in May 1944, inherited strategic situation where fuel scarcity constrained every operational decision. Toyoda's assessment was that Combined Fleet possessed perhaps 6 months of fuel reserves at normal operating tempo, that major fleet operations would consume reserves rapidly, that losses of fuel storage and transportation infrastructure to American bombing would accelerate depletion beyond current projection rates. The assessment meant that Toyoda had to plan operations with understanding that fleet might have single opportunity for major engagement before fuel exhaustion eliminated offensive capability entirely. The June 1944 Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated how fuel scarcity shaped Japanese operational planning and affected combat capability. Japanese carrier forces operated with knowledge that engagement represented major commitment of fuel reserves that losses could not be replaced, that outcome would significantly affect remaining operational capability. The tactical defeat, loss of over 300 aircraft and several carriers, was compounded by recognition that fuel consumed in the operation could not be regenerated, and that fleet's ability to conduct subsequent operations was reduced by engagement regardless of tactical outcome. The July 1944 loss of Saipan created immediate crisis for fuel supply because Ireland had served as intermediate staging point for tankers traveling from Southeast Asia to Japan. American control of Saipan positioned American aircraft to interdict shipping routes, forced tankers to take longer routes around threatened areas, reduced percentage of oil shipments reaching Japan to approximately 30% of production. The loss demonstrated that territorial defeats had direct consequences for resource supply and that defensive perimeter contractions were accelerating fuel exhaustion. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding 1st Air Fleet in Philippines, reported in August 1944 that fuel allocations for his command were insufficient to conduct meaningful training of new pilots, that operational readiness was declining as experienced pilots were lost in combat and replacements arrived inadequately trained due to fuel shortages. Onishi's assessment was that fuel scarcity was creating death spiral where inadequate training led to higher combat losses, which required more replacements who received even less training due to fuel constraints, progressively degrading Japanese air power capability, regardless of aircraft production or pilot recruitment. The October 1944 Battle of Leyte Gulf represented Japanese command's recognition that fuel scarcity required committing fleet to decisive battle rather than preserving it for future operations that might never come if fuel ran out. The operation consumed substantial portion of remaining fuel reserves, was planned with understanding that fleet would have difficulty conducting subsequent major operations regardless of Leyte Gulf's outcome, reflected desperation born from recognition that waiting for better opportunities meant fleet would be immobilized by fuel exhaustion before those opportunities arose. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding carrier decoy force at Leyte Gulf, operated with carriers that lacked adequate aircraft and fuel to constitute effective striking force, but whose presence might draw American attention from main Japanese battle forces. Ozawa's mission demonstrated how fuel scarcity had reduced once powerful Japanese carrier force to decoy role, how lack of fuel for training had left Japan without carrier air groups, even when carriers themselves survived, how operational planning had to account for fuel constraints as heavily as enemy capabilities in determining what missions were feasible. The sinking of multiple Japanese battleships and heavy cruisers at Leyte Gulf represented not just loss of warships, but elimination of vessels that consumed enormous quantities of fuel, and whose loss actually eased fuel supply crisis by reducing consumption. The recognition that losing battleships reduced fuel requirements demonstrated how completely fuel scarcity had inverted normal strategic calculations, where loss of major warships would be viewed as catastrophic regardless of other considerations. The November 1944 assessment by Naval General Staff of fuel situation following Leyte Gulf documented that reserves had been reduced to perhaps 8 weeks' supply at current consumption rates, that no significant resupply was anticipated because tanker fleet had been largely destroyed, and because American control of Philippines had severed supply routes from Southeast Asia. The assessment concluded that major naval operations were no longer possible due to fuel constraints, that remaining fuel should be conserved for defensive operations closer to Japan, that combined fleet's role as offensive force had ended due to resource exhaustion rather than due to tactical defeats alone. The strategic bombing campaign that American B-29s initiated against Japanese petroleum infrastructure in early 1945 eliminated remaining capacity to refine crude oil into usable fuels. The raids targeted refineries, synthetic fuel plants, and storage facilities with precision that destroyed production capacity faster than it could be repaired. The bombing demonstrated that even if crude oil could somehow be transported to Japan, capacity to process it into aviation gasoline, bunker fuel, or diesel had been largely eliminated, creating a situation where raw materials might exist but could not be transformed into usable products. Captain Toshikazu Omai, serving as operations officer in Combined Fleet, compiled assessment in February 1945, documenting that fuel reserves had declined to point where fueling major warships for operations was no longer feasible. Omai calculated that super battleship Yamato possessed fuel for perhaps single sortie from home waters, that cruisers and destroyers similarly could conduct 1 or 2 operations before exhausting available fuel, that aircraft fuel stocks would support perhaps 2 months of defensive operations at reduced sortie rates. The assessment meant that naval operations planning had to account for finality of each operation. Ships sortied with understanding they might lack fuel to return to port. The March 1945 recognition that fuel reserves were completely empty came through accumulation of evidence that could no longer be rationalized or minimized. The monthly fuel consumption reports showed reserves declining towards zero. The reports from refineries documented that production had ceased due to bombing damage. The assessments from Southeast Asia confirmed that oil fields remained under Japanese control, but oil could not be transported to Japan due to complete interdiction of sea lanes. The intelligence about American operations indicated that invasion of Japan proper was imminent and would occur when Japan lacked fuel to mount effective defense. The specific moment when Navy Minister Yonai received confirmation that reserves were exhausted cannot be identified precisely because depletion occurred progressively, and different officials recognize finality at different times. Some officers understood by February that meaningful reserves no longer existed. Others maintained hope through March that fuel might be found or that consumption could be reduced enough to preserve minimal operational capability. The consensus that emerged through March was that regardless of exact remaining quantities, fuel shortage had become absolute constraint that made conventional naval operations impossible. The operational implications of fuel exhaustion extended beyond naval forces to air forces that required aviation gasoline for operations. Army and Navy Air Forces received reports through March that aviation fuel stocks were sufficient for perhaps 6 to 8 weeks of defensive operations, that training flights had been suspended entirely, that operational sorties were being limited to essential missions only. The fuel shortage meant that aircraft sitting on airfields could not be flown, that pilots could not maintain proficiency, that defending against American invasion would require tactics that minimized fuel consumption, even if this reduced effectiveness. The decision to adopt kamikaze tactics as primary air defense method reflected recognition that fuel scarcity made conventional air operations unsustainable. Kamikaze missions required minimal fuel because aircraft did not need fuel to return to base, minimal training because pilots only needed to reach target and crash into it, minimal support infrastructure because aircraft damaged in mission could not return for repair anyway. The adoption of suicide tactics demonstrated how completely fuel exhaustion had constrained Japanese operational options, and how desperate Japanese command had become to find methods that might affect American operations despite resource scarcity. The specific calculations that led to adopting kamikaze tactics included assessments of fuel consumption per sortie for conventional versus suicide attacks. Conventional fighter sortie required fuel for takeoff, transit to combat area, engagement with enemy aircraft, and return to base. Total fuel consumption of perhaps 150 to 200 liters per aircraft. Kamikaze sortie required only fuel for takeoff and one-way transit to target. Total consumption of perhaps 70 to 100 liters. The 50% reduction in fuel consumption per sortie meant that available fuel stocks could support twice as many kamikaze missions as conventional missions, creating mathematical logic that reinforced ideological justifications for suicide tactics. The training requirements for kamikaze pilots reflected fuel scarcity's impact on Japanese aviation capabilities more broadly. Conventional fighter pilot training required hundreds of hours of flight time to develop skills needed for aerial combat, dogfighting, navigation, and aircraft handling under stress. Kamikaze training required perhaps 30 to 50 hours, focused on basic flying skills, navigation to target area, and dive approach techniques. The reduced training requirement meant that fuel allocated for training could produce more kamikaze pilots than conventional pilots. That pilot production could continue despite fuel shortages that had forced conventional training to be curtailed. That replacement rate for combat losses could be maintained through suicide tactics when conventional replacement had become impossible due to fuel constraints. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi's October 1944 proposal to employ kamikaze tactics on systematic basis emerged from his recognition that conventional air operations in Philippines could not be sustained given fuel limitations. Onishi calculated that his first air fleet lacked fuel to conduct defensive operations for more than few weeks at conventional sortie rates, that available fuel could support longer campaign if employed for one-way missions, that achieving hits on American carriers through kamikaze attacks might have greater impact than failing to achieve hits through conventional attacks by inadequately trained pilots. The proposal represented Onishi's assessment that fuel scarcity required tactical adaptation and that suicide missions optimized limited resources for maximum effect. The expansion of kamikaze operations from emergency expedient in Philippines to primary air defense method for homeland defense demonstrated institutional acceptance that fuel scarcity made conventional air warfare unsustainable. The tens of thousands of aircraft allocated for homeland defense through 1945 were intended primarily for kamikaze missions because fuel stocks could support one-way sorties but could not support conventional air operations at scale needed for effective defense. The planning reflected recognition that Japan's last operational reserve, aircraft production and pilot recruitment, could only be employed effectively through tactics that minimized fuel consumption. The psychological impact on Japanese aviation forces of shift to kamikaze tactics was profound and revealed how resource exhaustion affected morale and cohesion. Pilots understood that assignment to kamikaze units meant certain death, that survival prospects that had motivated conventional combat were eliminated, that their sacrifice was being rationalized through combination of resource scarcity and ideology. Some pilots accepted kamikaze assignment as honorable service to nation and as logical response to hopeless situation. Others recognized assignment as waste of lives in futile cause, but lacked means to refuse or to propose alternatives that fuel scarcity and command rigidity made impossible to implement. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding 5th Air Fleet assigned to defend Kyushu against invasion, reported in April that his forces possessed fuel for perhaps 30 days of intensive operations, that this fuel would be consumed in opposing American invasion, that no resupply was anticipated, and forces would be immobilized once reserves were exhausted. Ugaki's assessment was that Air Fleet could conduct single major defensive effort, then would cease to exist as operational force due to fuel depletion, that operational planning must assume finality of defensive battle because forces could not be reconstituted or redeployed after initial engagement. The specific operational plans for defending Kyushu against American invasion illustrated how completely fuel exhaustion shaped tactical concepts. Plans called for massing kamikaze attacks against invasion fleet during approach and landing phases when targets would be concentrated, and when achieving maximum hits would be critical to disrupting invasion. The attacks would consume all available aviation fuel in intensive operations lasting perhaps 3 to 5 days. After fuel exhaustion, surviving aircraft would be abandoned, pilots would transition to ground combat roles, and air defense would cease entirely. The planning demonstrated that fuel scarcity had reduced Japanese air power to single-use weapon that could be employed once, then would cease to exist. The ground forces' recognition that fuel exhaustion affected defensive capabilities came through reports that motorized units lacked fuel for movement, that tanks possessed minimal fuel for operations, that logistics transport was largely immobilized by fuel shortage. The immobility meant that reinforcing threatened sectors would be difficult, that mobile defense concepts requiring repositioning forces to meet American attacks could not be executed, that static defense from prepared positions represented only feasible strategy given fuel constraints. The specific impact on armored forces demonstrated how fuel scarcity degraded capabilities that were critical for mobile defense. Japanese tank units that should have constituted mobile reserves for counterattacking American beachheads lacked fuel to move from initial positions to threatened sectors. Tank commanders reported that vehicles possessed perhaps enough fuel to move 10 to 20 kilometers, distances inadequate to reach coastal areas from inland assembly areas where tanks were positioned to avoid American naval bombardment. The fuel shortage meant that tanks would be employed essentially as stationary pillboxes rather than as mobile weapons, that counterattack operations that featured prominently in defensive doctrine could not be executed, that American forces would face less effective opposition than Japanese force structure suggested. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding 5th Air Fleet assigned to defend Kyushu against invasion, reported in April that his forces possessed fuel for perhaps 30 days of intensive operations, that this fuel would be consumed in opposing American invasion, that no resupply was anticipated, and forces would be immobilized once reserves were exhausted. Ugaki's assessment was that Air Fleet could conduct single major defensive effort, then would cease to exist as operational force due to fuel depletion, that operational planning must assume finality of defensive battle because forces could not be reconstituted or redeployed after initial engagement. The ground forces' recognition that fuel exhaustion affected defensive capabilities came through reports that motorized units lacked fuel for movement, that tanks possessed minimal fuel for operations, that logistics transport was largely immobilized by fuel shortage. The immobility meant that reinforcing threatened sectors would be difficult, that mobile defense concepts requiring repositioning forces to meet American attacks could not be executed, that static defense from prepared positions represented only feasible strategy given fuel constraints. The impact on civilian economy of fuel exhaustion was severe and created humanitarian crisis that undermined home front morale. Transportation systems shut down as fuel for trains and vehicles was unavailable. Food distribution collapsed, creating starvation in cities. Industries closed because machinery could not operate without fuel. The civilian suffering demonstrated that fuel scarcity affected every aspect of Japanese society, and that continued resistance imposed costs on population that were becoming unbearable. The strategic assessment that senior Japanese leaders conducted through April to May 1945 regarding war continuation had to account for fuel exhaustion as constraint that made conventional defense increasingly impossible. The discussions acknowledged that defending against American invasion would be conducted with forces that lacked fuel for mobility, that air defense would be minimal due to fuel shortages, that naval forces could not oppose invasion fleet, that civilian population would face starvation as logistics collapsed. The acknowledgement created recognition that continued resistance might be futile, but political and ideological constraints prevented accepting this conclusion openly. Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, appointed Prime Minister in April 1945, received briefings about fuel situation that documented complete exhaustion of reserves and impossibility of resupply. Suzuki's assessment was that military situation was hopeless, not just due to enemy superiority, but due to Japan's inability to fuel forces needed for defense, that negotiated surrender might preserve something while continued resistance would result in complete destruction. The assessment reflected recognition among some senior leaders that fuel exhaustion made continued war effort unsustainable regardless of will to resist. The July discussion at Imperial Conference about responding to Potsdam Declaration occurred with knowledge that fuel exhaustion eliminated any realistic prospect of successful defense against American invasion. The military leaders who argued for continuing resistance despite hopeless situation understood that forces lacked fuel for effective operations, but maintained that honorable resistance was required regardless of outcome. The civilian leaders who advocated accepting surrender terms recognized that fuel exhaustion, among other factors, made resistance futile, and that accepting defeat while some governmental structure remained was preferable to fighting until complete societal collapse occurred. The August operational planning for defending against American invasion demonstrated how completely fuel exhaustion constrained Japanese capabilities. Plans called for aircraft to conduct kamikaze attacks until fuel was exhausted, then for pilots to fight as infantry. Naval vessels were to be beached and used as stationary gun platforms because fuel for maneuvering did not exist. Ground forces were to defend from static positions because fuel for movement was unavailable. Every aspect of defensive planning reflected adaptation to reality, that fuel to conduct mobile warfare or sustained operations no longer existed. The decision to accept Potsdam terms and to surrender unconditionally was influenced by multiple factors, including atomic bombings and Soviet entry into war. But fuel exhaustion represented underlying constraint that made continued resistance increasingly impossible, regardless of other considerations. The recognition that Japan lacked resources to fuel defensive operations, that civilian population was starving due to logistics collapse caused by fuel shortage, that every day of continued war consumed irreplaceable fuel reserves needed for post-war recovery, contributed to decision to end war before complete resource exhaustion eliminated any capacity for organized society to function. The post-war assessment of Japan's fuel situation confirmed that reserves were essentially zero at war's end, that strategic petroleum stockpiles that had existed in December 1941 had been completely consumed, that capacity to produce or import fuel had been eliminated by American interdiction and bombing. The assessment documented that fuel exhaustion had been a progressive crisis the Japanese command had anticipated from war's beginning, that efforts to secure and transport oil from Southeast Asia had failed due to American submarine and air campaigns. That strategic premise that Japan could sustain war effort through captured resources had proven false as American forces demonstrated capability to interdict supply lines and to destroy production and refining infrastructure. The comparison between Japanese fuel situation in December 1941 and August 1945 illuminated trajectory of resource exhaustion that had shaped war's course. Japan had initiated war with strategic reserves of approximately 54 million barrels of petroleum products, possessed access through conquest to production capacity that might have sustained operations if oil could be transported to Japan and refined. By war's end, stockpiles were exhausted, production facilities in Southeast Asia were cut off from Japan, refining capacity had been destroyed, and Japan possessed perhaps few 100,000 barrels of crude oil that could not be refined into usable fuels. The 4-year trajectory, from resource adequacy to complete exhaustion, demonstrated that American strategy of targeting Japanese logistics and resource supply had achieved devastating effectiveness. The moment when Japanese High Command learned fuel reserves were completely empty cannot be identified as single revelation, because recognition came progressively through late 1944 and early 1945, as various indicators converged to demonstrate that crisis was complete. The October 1944 Leyte Gulf operation consumed major portion of remaining reserves. The November 1944 assessment documented that resupply was no longer possible. The February to March 1945 reports confirmed that stocks were nearly exhausted and refining capacity had been destroyed. The April to May recognition that invasion defense would be conducted without adequate fuel represented final acknowledgement that resource exhaustion had eliminated Japanese capability to conduct conventional military operations. The learning was reluctant and incomplete because accepting finality of fuel crisis meant accepting that war was lost regardless of will to resist. But by summer 1945, even officers committed to continued resistance understood that fuel constraints made effective defense impossible. The final assessment was that Japanese High Command learned through progressive crisis from late 1944 through mid-1945 that fuel reserves were completely empty, that strategic petroleum stockpiles accumulated before war were exhausted, that capacity to resupply from Southeast Asian oil fields had been eliminated by American interdiction, that refining capacity needed to process crude oil into usable fuels had been destroyed by strategic bombing. The learning forced recognition that Japan's war effort had been premised on securing and maintaining access to resources that were no longer available, that operational planning had to account for fuel scarcity as absolute constraint, that continued resistance was being conducted with forces that lacked fuel for effective operations. The fuel exhaustion represented failure of strategic premise that had justified war's initiation, demonstrated effectiveness of American strategy targeting Japanese logistics and resources, created conditions where military defeat was inevitable, regardless of tactical capabilities or will to resist. The recognition contributed to decision to surrender by demonstrating that Japan lacked physical resources to continue fighting, even if political will to resist remained, that fuel exhaustion among other resource shortages had eliminated capacity to defend effectively against invasion, that prolonging war would achieve nothing except additional destruction of society that lacked resources to sustain itself through continued conflict.